So John, I'm really curious about your topics of show series that you have on your channel.
Yeah.
You know, you could pick any series that you want. You happen to gravitate towards a few of them. I think that they're cool.
Thank you.
Um, I know that you're a big fan of live shows. I know you go to a lot more concerts than I do. And I want to ask you some about like how you feel about live albums to where I have certain thoughts on them, but you can start by just telling me why you chose to make that one of your main focuses for your channel.
Okay. The live cut, I was just talking to Ernesto Ramos one day, and I was just saying we were at that point I was just doing show solo. And my goal was to do 100 solo shows before I started having guests on because I
Hmm.
wanted to get my footing going solo because up until then I always worked with someone on different channels. He was saying we were going to talk about Accept's live album Staying Alive on John Claus's channel, My Music Corner, as part of the Accept series, but we never did. So Ernesto and I were talking, and he goes, "Why don't we talk about it on your channel?" And I go, "Well, okay, no problem." I go, "I could talk about it easy, no problem. I own the album." So he goes, "Yeah," and I was thinking, maybe I would talk more about live albums that you don't always hear about because you'd always hear about Kiss Alive One, you'd always hear about Peter Frampton Comes Alive, you'd always hear about Ted Nugent
Utica.
or Cheap Trick Budokan or Foghat Live or on and on. UFO Strangers in the Night. We always talk about UFO Strangers in the Night. If you're part of Contrarians, we all know how great that is. Or Deep Purple, live in Japan or Made in Japan or whatever, or Iron Maiden live after death. So I said, yeah, I want to talk about something like that. He goes, yeah, you could call the show the Live Cut. So Ernesto named the show. And so I said, yeah, okay. That sounds good. So we did the show together. And at first I was like, okay, well, this went over very well. Let me do a few more. And then eventually I made it like a weekly thing. With the albums, what I say to my guests is you can pick the album or I could pick the album. And if you pick an album and if I don't own it, I'll buy it within reason. I'm not going to drop 35 $40 on a CD, for example, on something I may not listen to much afterwards. So that became the live cut. Because it was the thing I wanted to do here is talk about stuff that doesn't get discussed. We always talk ACDC. We're always talking about the Bon Scott era. And Back in Black and albums like that. How come we're not talking about the later ones? So you could do that with any band that's had a lot of albums. So that was where the latter day albums came in. Live cuts similar because you may talk about a live album that was recorded in the 70s, or you may be talking about a live album that was recorded 10 years ago. It whether it's known or it's very little known, it's something I like to talk about. And what's been cool about it is some of the suggestions that people have made. It's like, I never thought I'd be talking about an Elvis Presley live album, but that's what Marco wanted to do. And I was like, and when I read about it, I didn't realize it was this big 5 million selling album. I didn't know it. And I never hear anybody talk about it. So I was like, okay, this fits in with the live cut. And at the same time, I'm talking about stuff that may have been like, for example, Blackfoot's live album wasn't released it was recorded in the early 80s, but it didn't get released in the United States for another 20 years. So that would be something good for a live cut because by that point, Blackfoot's star had fallen and Ricky Medlock, their leaders, playing in Leonard Skinner. So that's kind of where how it all started, and then it's just grown from there. But I always when I reach out to people, I say, okay, You could pick the album or I could. Most of the time they pick it, but once in a while they'll say, why don't you pick it? And then I'll think of ones that I've been wanting to talk about for a while. That was why I did Bruce Springsteen, Hammersmith Odeon 75, for example. That was one I always wanted to talk about. And Jez Ketra said, why don't you pick it? And I was like, good. Same thing with Ryan when we talked about War Live 1974, which was an archival release that came out last year. And I was like, this is a dynamite album. I want to talk about this. And he goes, what do you want to talk about? And I mentioned War. He goes, okay. And you didn't bat an eye. So there you go. That's the live cut.
You know what? It's interesting about how I've evolved on the way that I feel about live albums. When I was younger, when I was getting into rock, um, and I would avoid live albums like the plague.
Okay.
Um, for from my experience, the way that I can explain what listening to a live album was, it was like saying, let's go to the cinema and watch a movie, and then when the movie starts, just close your eyes the whole time. I couldn't get across the um, I'm not there and I'm supposed to be seeing it and sort of feeling it. And what's the point? Why am I only hearing it? It seems like I'm only getting half of, um, it seems like I'm only getting half of the experience. Like I don't understand it. Plus, on top of that, the studio quality, like I can hear everything and it's nice and crisp, and that's sort of being compromised because it's out in the open air, and then there's like crowd participation coming in the middle of it. So it's at that point, it's not even just like watching the movie with your eyes closed. It's watching the movie with your eyes closed, and you can hear the person behind you talking and having a conversation while you're trying to get into the movie. That's kind of how I felt originally about live albums. And I don't remember what the first one was. It took a while. I think that what got me into accepting live albums was probably Pink Floyd, because I started to appreciate if the song was had a different arrangement, or they were going to jam for a long time and it was going to be different on purpose. Um, then I was interested because you got to hear something that you wouldn't get to have on the studio release. So when it came to like when I got to be a Kiss fan, and I would see that Alive would get brought up as like what catapulted them and stuff, and there's always like the Cheap Trick and Frampton and stuff, where like those albums are the ones that really took the band to another level, having those live albums. There's what they were before the live album and what they were after the live album came out. That I didn't ever understand why Kiss Alive, because the way that they sound on the studio cuts, I still think is the preferred way.
Okay.
I've talked to people before; they disagree with me. It's not like there's a debate on it, like music's subjective, but like there's not like a big difference in the way that what you're hearing, besides the quality of uh, of the um, the recording. I know that I understand that going to see the band live is sort of like a truth serum for like if the band really can fly or not. Like the energy is more important than the perfection behind it.
Right.
And the crowd actually being part of the recording sort of like adds on to that. So instead of it being now the way that I look at it, and I still don't gravitate towards live albums, but I don't have the stigma against them like I used to. I don't avoid them. There's now, instead of it going to the cinema and trying to like experience the movie with your eyes closed, it's the opposite, to where it's like when people say reading a book the book is better than the movie from movies that have been adapted from a book, novel or whatever, where they usually you ask them, well, why is it that? And the two main reasons usually are, well, you can fit a lot more story into the book. If everything that was in the story got into the movie would be like 5 hours long, and that's just not feasible, right?
Right.
And the other thing is like you're using your own imagination and you're using your own imagery in your mind and sort of like flexing that like imaginary muscle to come up with what you think the story should be. And you're kind of like in place of that. So now I take it to where I assume that when people that love live albums that always did, that's the experience. Instead of watching movie with your eyes closed, it's I'm reading the book and I'm picturing it like in my mind. I'm picturing as if I was there.
Yes.
And that works better, I guess, for bands when they're not together anymore, or they're not a band. People have passed away or whatever. Like, so you can't see them live, or they are together, but they just don't sound as good as they used to because age and stuff like that like has taken its toll on the singer's voice or whatnot. But sometimes people say that like some bands are better live than they even are with their studio recordings. Um, you must have certain bands that you feel that way that you've seen live. Maybe you're a big fan of that. I know the obvious one is like the jam bands because they jam and stuff like, and they're usually, I always say Grateful Dead's better live recordings than like the studio stuff. But that's sort of comes with the territory of that seems to be like the mission statement behind where the band's going. What drives them is like the improv and sort of like elaborating and whatnot. But independent from those bands, like I'm curious to know like what some of the bands are that you have that you still think like they're doing the same thing that they do in the studio recording, but still they sound better live.
Well, if you talk about that, well, Rush always tried to replicate the studio albums when they played live. At least by the time Neil Peart was in the band, that was their thing. We want to play the best version of Spirit of Radio we can. We want to play the best version of YYZ we can, etc. So to me, they were always an awesome live band. I saw them 3 times. I would say the second time I saw them, I think was one of the best live shows I ever saw. And I love the fact that they hit every album except for Presto on that tour too. So it was nice that we got that kind of variety, and the songs they sounded the same, a little more energy. Of course, the crowd really feeding off that energy, and just when they'd play a song and you recognize what they're playing and the roar you would hear before that. And of course, Neil always had a wonderful drum solo. I mean, it would usually be the same solo every tour. So that's why I'd only see him once every tour, where I had friends who would see him 5 or 6 times. And I was like, why would you see him 5 or 6 times? Because you wouldn't have something different like you'd have with Little Feat, where Little Feat, my favorite band, I've seen them more times than anybody, but every time you see them, it's a different show. And they could be doing Dixie Chicken a little different one night. The jam might be a little bit different. They may go into another song right off it. Sometimes they will not do that. Or sometimes they'll put a few other songs together that you typically wouldn't expect. Or they would be playing some rhythm that's similar to something else and they'd start playing that song. So I think with jam bands, it works really well. As far as like a lot of with hard rock bands, yeah, it really depends on the band. If you go way back, Poison destroyed live. I saw them on the Look What the Cat Dragged In tour, and they were way better than they were on record. And then Rat came out. Poison was opening for Rat, and Rat didn't sound that good at all. So, I mean, I think it's just a band by band basis. Metallica, I saw last year, but I had seen them in '89. I saw them in '94. They were always great live. And it was just that they mixed things up. They didn't really mess around much. And right now they got the big stage show and all that, but I always thought they had more energy live. Slayer destroys live. I saw them once. I was hurting in places I didn't know exist the next day.
Thank you, Slayer.
Exactly. Some on Thanksgiving Eve, the next day, I'm like helping cook Thanksgiving. I'm like, Jesus Christ, I'm dying here. And they play 90 minutes. And since back then, maybe we would have said 90 minutes, that's not long enough. 90 minutes was fine. Because normally I would like run out of the arena. Well, it was at the Sands Casino. Now it's called Wind Creek Event Center. I would like run to my car. I couldn't run. I was in too much pain because I was headbanging like I was when I was a teenager and I was in my mid 40s, right? They were fantastic live. It's a case by case basis. Like a lot of bands that I see these days are in small theaters and clubs, and maybe some of them I'm catching on the way out. Maybe they're not what they once were. And then a lot of them are just more in the blues and all that. And maybe the songs are a little better live because they're stretching them out. So that's one thing. A lot of what's really been cool going back to the live cut is some of these bands I never saw live. And it would take me back to why I liked live music in the 80s. Well, part of it was I'm not old enough to drive there, but this is what it feels like. Or maybe this band isn't around anymore, but this is what it felt like back then if I was 10 years older. That was the genesis of me getting into live music in the first place, because all those classic live albums that we would talk about on the Contrarians, I had those in the 80s on cassette. I bought at $4 for some of those cassettes. But part of it was, and back then you couldn't see as many concerts as you could see now, because back then you made a lot more money from record sales, and now people aren't buying records. I mean, now they're streaming music more, so the artists are making minuscule amounts off of that.
Yeah.
So it was a different time. Back then you had less bands touring, but they might be doing more dates. And I think a lot of the older bands that came back, I mean, I in my 20s and 30s, I didn't even think I'd ever see them. Oh, they're old, they're never gonna come back. And all of a sudden, Iron Butterfly is coming back out, just for an example. Like all these bands that were older, like, oh, Foghat's going back out. Oh, I didn't see Foghat when I discovered Foghat live in '85. So yeah, I know I'm kind of skirting around your question a little bit here, but there's certain bands that really, really impressed me live. Some of them were like Garth Brooks kills live. Garth Brooks was one of the best concerts I ever saw in my life. And there was so much energy and passion from that stage. I didn't know I owned one Garth Brooks album, the hits, right? There was so much energy on that stage. He had charisma out the wazoo, and everybody in his band was there since he was playing clubs. So you knew they were tight. They had their
Yeah.
down. And it was like country meets Kiss in the presentation, but it blew me to freak away. And I was like, well, I don't hear this on country radio. Friends in Low Places live doesn't sound like what I know. For example, he was one I was like, he played 4 shows over 2 nights in an 18,000 seat arena in Philly. And I think he sold them all out. I can understand why. He was amazing. You ever go to a show, David, where it's like, oh, he sings this too? That happened to me 5 times that night. I didn't realize how many freaking hits he had. I thought that was an Alan Jackson song. I thought that was a Clint Black song. I'm not even a big country guy. Destroyed me. Destroyed me. I took a bus trip there, and I went alone because nobody was going to go with me to see Garth Brooks. I remember going to the bar, who they all knew I like to go to shows, right? Well, who are you going to see? Garth Brooks. Oh, well, I bet she puts on a good show. Every single person said that to me. Oh, not expecting it. Then I went to see him, and they're like, "Well, how was it?" I go, "Holy shit, it was amazing!" I go see him if you get a chance. So there's a good example. And then like a lot of the other ones were more legacy artists, but I think it was the fact that I'm seeing Paul McCartney. I'm seeing a living legend. I'm seeing Elton John. I'm seeing a living legend. And you know, Elton John still had a couple of the original guys in his band from like the 70s, and that was pretty freaking cool. And I mean, he didn't sing the way he used to, but he knew how to entertain, by God. And Paul McCartney did too. So that's yeah. I think the ones who've been around forever, who had to grind, they know how to entertain. They paid their dues. They had to impress people for like small paydays before they made it. And I think they were like, okay, well, we can't let up now. We got to keep that fire. So yeah, Garth Brooks, I think would be, and Bruce Springsteen, same thing. He would be another one that, you know, you always hear, oh, I hear he's so great live. He's great live. He was amazing. So there you go. What do you think of the live cut show here on John the Music Nut? Please let us know in the comments what you think. Thank you all for watching.